get through what we've been up to. So welcome everybody to the February monthly meeting. My name is Jared Nigro, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pasadena Audubon Society. We're happy to see you all here joining us. Um, so let's move forward. Also, what a great photo of the American white pelicans, right? Okay. So we're going to start off with some really fun news, and it's actually great that Eric Strauss and Lisa Fimiani are here because I'll let them get into it, but they're deeply connected to hummingbirds as well. So we had this announcement go out yesterday that Pasadena Audubon Society is installing a hummingbird cantina at the Gamble House just down the street from us. We're extremely excited. So this is this is a great sort of comeback story for this and a great community story because of course we were going to install this at the Eaton Canyon Nature Center, and then with that tragic loss we had to find a new home. And almost a week after the fact, Cheryl Scott at the Gamble House and I had coffee, and she said, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And I said, "Well, we have this cantina, this hummingbird cantina, that we need to find a new home for." And she said, "Come by and look around and see if this would work." And they have been so welcoming and wonderful to work with. It's incredible that we've been able to make this happen so quickly after such a tragic change in plans. So the cantina, of course, is set up because a lot of hummingbirds have lost some food sources because of the fires. And so we're trying to give them some nourishment down here, more in the valley. So the cantina will be part of the Nancy Greenglass Memorial Garden. It's just right behind the bookstore. It looks like the little garage on separate from the house. We're right behind that. It has a nice bench. It's nicely shaded, and it's very flat and accessible. So yesterday we put out this e-blast because we're having volunteers, of course, clean and refill the cantina. And within, I think like 2 hours, we got something like 25, 30 volunteers signing up, and it has been growing and growing and growing. So we've been looking at all of the folks who want to volunteer. And this really means a lot to us because this is not just a one-time volunteer opportunity. This is a 3-month volunteer opportunity. So your passion means a lot to us. And so we're going to go through the list as it comes in, and then we're going to notify those who fit in the schedule perfectly. And then if you're not selected, just know that we're going to be doing this for a while. And so if it's not right now, there will be another chance right around the corner, and we need substitutes as well. So don't worry, you will be cleaning a hummingbird feeder at some point in your future. So don't feel bad if you're not the first to do it. Okay, field trips. So Darren Dow is our wonderful field trip chair. He had to step down with some. He works, at JPL, and so he's had to. So one of his projects is taken off, and so he's had to step down. And so Carl's been helping us take over. So thank you, Carl. And so we have field trips for the remainder of the month, but unfortunately they're all filled up and we have a long wait list. So please, you can always go on our website and look at the field trips tab and see upcoming ones. We're going to announce the next batch for March coming up next week, because it's already the end of February next week. Next, I clicked out of that somehow. Sorry, 1 second. 1 second. Let's see here. Okay, next we have our wonderful Birds and Beers coming up next Wednesday, February 26th at Wild Parrot Brewing Company, our monthly get-together from 5 to 8 p.m. We had a great turnout last month. And of course, Carl has done a great job of creating themes for our Birds and Beers. And gosh, there's no streaming service in the world that will match the entertainment of this month, which is a special belated Valentine's edition featuring a poetry recital. Now, if you want to see something incredible, it's bird poetry recitals. It compose a few lines of a verse, a sonnet, a haiku, even a limerick dedicated to a bird you adore. And of course, thanks to Wild Parrot Brewery, they donate $1 for every pint. So please come by. It's a great place to also pick up dinner if you are hungry. Okay, lastly, we have Hahamanga Habitat Project. I'm guessing Darren's not here. And Helen, if you're here and you want to jump in, feel free to. But I'll start it off and please cut me off if you want to. So this is the Hahamanga Watershed Park in Pasadena. So our next work day is on Saturday, February 22nd. That's coming up this Saturday at 8 a.m. And this is a removal of invasive plants. So we need your help to nurture native chaparral and riparian plants in the Hahamanga natural area. Bring your own tools or share with others. No experience needed. It's pretty straightforward, and of course, we're always willing to help explain anything that might be confusing or challenging. For more details, you can contact Darren Dow, and that's his email down at the bottom. And if you can't catch it, you can always just email me or Carl or PasadenaAudubon@gmail.com, and we'll forward it to Darren. All right. The March monthly meeting, I'll give it to Chris.
Okay. Yeah. So next month, exactly 28 days from today, we have Pasadena Audubon's favorite husband and wife big bird team, Tammy and David McQuaid. Many of you will remember them from several months ago when they talked about how they do a big year. And this time they're going to be zooming in on part of what they do with their annual big years, and that is go to Hawaii and looking at the amazing and unique birds there. They also have done a lot of conservation work in Hawaii, and they're going to have I guarantee there's going to be a lot of amazing photography, some great stories, a little bit of more than a little bit of sadness about the fact that so many birds in Hawaii are under threat of extinction. As you can see, the title of the talk is the extinction capital of the world. But they'll also hopefully have a bit of hope for some of the work that they and others are doing to save the birds of Hawaii. So we hope you'll join us 1 month from tonight on Wednesday, March 19th. This is also a Zoom only meeting, and we hope to see you then.
Thank you, Chris. All right. Now, tonight's speakers. So after the fire, so this is a two-part series. This is you're getting two speakers for the price of one. And I'm excited to introduce them both. I've known them both for many years now, and they're Lisa and Eric are both near and dear to my heart. So first, we'll start off with Lisa. This is Lisa Fimiani, everybody. So Lisa, she serves as the Drollinger Environmental Fellow with Loyola Marymount University's Center for Urban Resilience, or CURES, you might hear us say it for short, for the past 4 years now. And for the past 4 years, and now the Drollinger Environmental Leadership Fellow. Lisa Fimiani has reached thousands of Los Angeles Angelinos, teaching the principles of the Gottlieb Native Garden, we've talked about before with a previous speaker, while inspiring visitors at the Ballona Discovery Park through informational tours and education program. As part of her responsibilities, Lisa also serves as an ambassador to support other CURES staff members in the community with education initiatives, as well as represent CURES at events and functions. And over the past 35 years, Lisa acquired extensive knowledge of birds, insects, and other wildlife in SoCal as the Friends of Ballona Wetlands Executive Director for 7 years, and the docent at the Ballona Freshwater Marsh for 19 years, and board member for over 17 years. Lisa also served 16 years on the Audubon California and Los Angeles Audubon Society nonprofit boards. So we have Lisa. Let's welcome Lisa. And next, our second speaker, Dr. Eric Strauss. He's the executive director of Center for Urban Resilience. He serves as the president's professor of biology at Loyola Marymount University and executive director, like I said. With collaborative research specialties in animal behavior, endangered species management, urban ecosystems, and science education, Eric has extended the model for faculty scholarship by co-founding the Urban Ecology Institute in Boston, while he served as a faculty member at Boston College and CURES in LA. both of which provide educational, research, and restoration programs to underserved neighborhoods and their residents. In addition, Dr. Strauss is the founding editor of a web-based peer-reviewed journal, Cities and the Environment, which is funded in part by the USDA Forest Service. His research includes collaborative long-term studies of coyotes, white-tailed deer, crows, turtles, and other vertebrates, with a specialty in understanding wildlife in urban areas and the appropriate management responses to wildlife problems and zoonotic disease. His work also includes investigating the role of green space and urban forests in supporting of healthy neighborhoods and how these features can be used to improve science, education, and restorative justice. He's also co-written multimedia textbooks in biology and urban ecology, as well as hosting multiple video series on the life sciences and ecology. Dr. Strauss has received his BS in mass communications from Emerson College and a PhD in biology from Tufts University. And he also wrote the Hummingbirds book with the Gottlieb Native Garden. And we'll hopefully get him to sign some of these books when we have a little celebration party at the Gamble House for the Hummingbird Cantina. So please uh, welcome our two wonderful speakers, Lisa and Eric. All right, I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Let me bring up my PowerPoint for this evening, and then Lisa will bring up hers. There we go. First of all, thank you so much, Jared, for inviting us here tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity, and we arrive with so much trauma that has happened on the national scale here in Southern California with the fires. We're all reeling, and it's warm and lovely to come to a place like an Audubon group because we have very different life experiences, but we come together because we share a love for birds, we share a love for conservation, and a commitment to nature that we wish everybody had, and we do our best to make sure that many people will. And during the introduction, I'm reminded of growing up on Cape Cod and being 10 or 11 years old and starting with the Audubon programs in Wellfleet on Cape Cod, and having this entree into this incredibly lovely world that we share and we shepherd. And so tonight, I mean, I start with this image that's heartbreaking, but it's also an opportunity for us as Angelenos, as members of this community, bring members of nature to re-arise like the phoenix. And nature rejuvenates, we will rejuvenate, and the future will move on. And so tonight, Lisa and I really titled our talk After the Fires. What do we know about these phenomena? How do we think about moving forward? We're not here to provide a lot of answers, but maybe perspectives to think about. Part of what our center does is to help communities think about greening opportunities. We developed some of the first super high resolution maps of canopy cover in Los Angeles, and we work throughout California in regreening initiatives and helping communities sort through the options. And especially when something like this comes through, a natural disaster, fire, something like that, suddenly the slate in some ways wiped clean, and people have to think about what the restoration models look like. And of course, the models are going to look different than they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago because the population is different and the climate has shifted and the gray infrastructure has transformed Los Angeles. So it's an interesting challenge. It's a very interesting challenge. And because this is recorded, I will probably leave this for you to read later. But this was something that we collectively wrote right after the fires. And we feel so strongly at the Center for Urban Resilience that, it's all ecology is people-centered. Ecology is a study of the interaction among things, not the study of the things themselves. And so we are saddened by the offense of these most recent wind-driven fires. We all have been exposed to our vulnerability and frailty as humans, but it also provides us an opportunity to think more deeply and to live more deeply the commitment that we have towards nature. And this picture was taken on January 9th by Lisa right outside our office, and you can see the fire in the Palisades lifting above the hills as we looked from Loyola Marymount University, a very ominous image. And I include this image. This is from the Angeles National Forest. These are embers flying through the fires. And we're going to talk a fair amount about embers tonight because when the press and when we listen to people talking about fires, we tend to describe these conflagrations in ways that make us forget the way in which these fires actually spread and these embers which become ambassadors to more distant fire. And I have to say that it was quite a surprise to me. My wife and I live in El Segundo, and the morning of the fires, we were out early in our condominium, which is 7.5 miles from the fire front, and there were live embers landing on our street. And so, we are invited to think about the way in which these fire-fed systems actually move. I also want to remind ourselves of the incredibly large role that humanity plays in the current ecosystems of the planet. If you added up all the weight of the stuff that we've produced, the so-called anthropogenic mass, the buildings, the plastic, the materials, it actually outweighs all the natural biomass of the planet. And that seems almost impossible when you think of the fact that our industrial engines, if you will, are only a few centuries old. And it took us a long, long time to reach the first billion, and now we're almost at 8.5 billion people on the planet. And so our impact is gigantic. And so, in some ways, really throughout this talk, I want to remind you that the language that we develop to talk about the things around us, and of course, as a social species, language is really important to us, as it is to dolphins, as it is to chimpanzees, as it is to hummingbirds, as it is to honeybees. We develop these language to understand the complexity around us. But yet, our languages also traps us into meanings and structures of understanding that can limit our ability to really be effective in nature. And one of those descriptors is that we tend to think of the human-built community and the quote-unquote natural community. Those are dangerous divisions because it's not as though the materials that are in the anthropogenic part of the world somehow came from a different planet. They all came from this planet. They're all organic materials. They're just in different forms and they recycle at different times. And so we cannot divorce ourselves from nature, no matter how thick the walls we build. It's all the same stuff. So here we see an image of all of the stuff, the metals, the asphalt, the bricks, the aggregates, the concrete, the plastics, and so forth. You know, it's only been recently, but now that exceeds the weight of all the living and biomaterials on the planet. It's really extraordinary. Another idea I want to bring forward, and some of you have probably already heard this before, it emerged in the late 1960s from a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, was the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And it has to do with the way that ecological resources tend to be used by humans and the way they exist in the world. And the first law of this idea is that you can never do just one thing because we're enmeshed in systems. When we modify something, that automatically causes something else to change. And so part of the way we work as humans, especially in our sciences and medicine, because we're rational and profoundly secular and evidence driven, which is good stuff, but we tend to isolate our knowledge. And therefore we can focus on one thing and try and understand that. But that understanding is quite limited unless we understand how it's embedded in the rest of the system. So in an unsustainable ecosystem, arguably the one we are in now, there is no final technical solution. We cannot create technology enough to save ourselves from the degrading of the natural systems. We can assist the natural systems. We can protect the natural systems. We can remove the most dangerous substances we create in natural systems and to try and isolate them in areas where they do harm, but we cannot divorce ourselves. And so with that understanding, here's a scenario. In the article that was written by Garrett Hardin, the idea was that if you created this pasture, and if you come from New England like I do, that the towns there around a common green area, and the areas were used as common pasture lands. And over time, you add more and more cattle to these pasture lands, and people are growing the cattle and getting livelihoods out of them and so forth. But at some point, the number of animals in this pasture exceeds the capacity of the pasture to provide sustainable resources. But the tragedy is, as the resource gets more difficult to produce, the value goes up to the point where the last surviving cow in that pasture is the most valuable cow. And so the individual who owns that cow gets all of the value at the time that cow is sold. But those of us who are in the communal pasture suffer the degradation. But the individual who owns the cattle only suffers a portion of the degradation of the resource. You get all the benefit, but only suffer part of the cost. And I lived through a period in the 1970s and 80s in New England where the fishing industry collapsed because of overfishing. And it's still that way now to some degree, but the big billfish, some of them are worth close to $1 million when you catch them. So it pays to have that spotter plane and all the technology to get the last one because it's worth so much. And it's like this in nature. I mean, humans are not unique in this capacity. The first image on the right, this is a bacterium that's being overcome by phage virus. We know a lot about the world by studying their relationship of viruses to bacteria, which is one of the ways we know we can't divorce ourselves from the rest of the world, because the very simplest organisms on the planet are the ones that make us sick, because we use the same metabolic mechanisms. And these phage, the viruses, will surround the bacteria and take the resources out, and eventually the bacterium succumbs. But the viruses don't stop building themselves. They end up using the system till the end. And we have two other examples here. Slime molds, which grow on the surfaces of the fascinating biology of slime molds. They change their structure, they change their genetics. And as they use up the surfaces, they use the last materials they can to reproductive spores to send themselves somewhere else. They end up killing the population. The final example is something on a scale we see all the time, which are trees. You know, trees are, as I like to say, trees are on a journey to the sun. They don't get very far, but the only thing that matters, they get farther than the tree next to them, because they need the sunlight to do photosynthesis, that miracle transformation that makes all other life possible on the planet. And, you know, we are so blessed to have had the evolution of photosynthetic chemicals that change shape and capture inorganic light and turn it into organic molecules. I mean, wow, that's just amazing. And trees are doing that, but they're trying to outcompete, and eventually the forest begins to die of its own overproduction of metabolic activities, where if the trees simply reduce their consumption, they could all live there, but that's not how they work. We do know now that some trees communicate with one another and actually share materials, and it's a little more complicated than we think. But this kind of competition happens across all kinds of scales. So when we see it happening in humanity, we should not think that it's somehow a sin of humanness. It is a trait of survival that has been built into the processes of natural selection. Now, we're smart enough and sentient enough that we don't have to succumb to it, but we do have to be aware that it's part of a system of drivers. Now, let's add this to the thing that humans do. You know, our species is Homo sapiens, but we really should be Homo metropolis. We're a new species. Now we build cities. And most of the world's population now lives in cities. In the most developed nations, it's 70% or more. And there's an irony here, of course, that cities are only possible because we have agriculture. because we don't have to spend our time looking for food. The other super social, sentient, really smart animals like chimps and elephants and dolphins, they still spend all their day looking for food because they don't grow it themselves. Some species of termites do, but we're really the only advanced social species that grows food, which has allowed us then to create granaries and beginning about 10,000 years ago. And so once you grow food, you need to protect it, you need to store it, you don't carry it with you, so you build cities. But again, cities are only possible because of the agrarian lands or the transformative processes of agriculture in cities that are possible. But as we build these cities, they're good things. They allow us to do lots of different things. You can be an historian, an artist, a scientist. You can be a business person, all these kind of things, because someone else is growing your food. And then we have to have systems of control and distribution, and we have to tax it, and because we need infrastructure and so forth. So we build cities, and emerging out of this process in the past 50 years has been a brand new field of ecology called urban ecology, where scientists like myself study how systems operate. And we study them with the same tools we would bring if we were studying the desert or studying the near shore or studying montane systems or studying alpine meadows. We're studying cities as ecological phenomena. And what happens in cities? Well, we fragment the habitat. We change the way that predators work. We tend to remove the top order predators. Most of us would not be really happy with bears and mountain lions walking down Wilshire Boulevard, but we'll tolerate coyotes and opossums and raccoons. And so we change the structure of the predators, which changes productivity. It changes stress-related factors such as temperature and nutrients. It certainly changes species composition, and then we add human activity. So what do we end up with? We end up with this very patchy network. We give it a fancy name called spatial heterogeneity, but what it means is it's very patchy. And so we change the way that energy moves. There's local extinction events, something we were talking about before the meeting started. And of course, for those of you who know, there's no such thing as local extinction. Things are either extinct or they're not. But the press has developed this term, so we use it. Local extinction, the term really is extirpation, but we use local extinction. It's sort of like the term somewhat unique. Something's either unique or it isn't. You don't really use an adjective in front of it. And basically what happens in cities is that these massive changes in spatial and temporal scales. Something speed up, something slow down. And then through all of this, we have forests growing. And so when we think about one of the great challenges to our built environment, we have weather challenges. We have sea level that's rising. If you're from the East Coast like I'm, you have hurricanes that come through. From the Midwest, where my mom's from, you have tornadoes come through. Some places have earthquakes, and so forth. In California, we get to have a lot of these things. These become changes that happen really fast. Ecosystems are always changing. Sometimes, and we call these forces and drivers. And the drivers that happen slowly are the presses. Sea level rise is a press. Human economic development is a press. But some things are pulses. They happen quickly. Earthquakes, fires, that kind of thing. A war breaks out and there's violence among communities, social groups. Those are pulses. For a whole variety of drivers, some of which we'll talk about tonight, but some of which we won't because we don't have enough time. Wildfire has become a much larger driver, a pulse within urban ecosystems. And not just in Southern California, but Southern California gets most of the coverage because the conflagrations are happening so often and they're happening so intensively. So let's take a look at the number of structures destroyed by wildfires as monitored by the U.S. Forest Service. Look at the numbers that are happening. I mean, you see changes by the order of magnitude. And so when we begin to study the ecology of fire and fire science, as you probably know, we've come through a century where we began to consider fire to be a very bad process in ecological systems. So we went through a relatively long period in this country of attempted fire suppression. And at the same time, we really overplanted our forests. And that's had all kinds of repercussions. It's caused changes in the amount of water available in watersheds. If we think about the water crisis we have in Southern California, it's driven by open seas and the reduction in the water table as it is by the lack of snow or the drought itself. And so emerging out of this is a deeper understanding of how we think about the risk of wildfire. And U.S. Forest Service helps us do this through a three-pronged system, the so-called likelihood, intensity, and susceptibility. The likelihood of a fire is where will ignition come from? Are there hazardous land uses that increase the likelihood? The intensity is a function of the structure of the landscape. And susceptibility has a strong social component because it's how communities prepare, how they're structured, what is the infrastructure like. And this collectively adds up to wildfire risk. Some of it we can control. Some of it, there's a tremendous amount of randomness to it that really makes us uncomfortable. Because most of us who are either have a science background or come from this rational history, I like to blame it on Isaac Newton, who in the 16th century said, look, the universe is like a perfect machine. And he developed calculus and other ways to torture young science students to understand it in a quantitative way. But in reality, the universe is actually much more random than we'd like to think it is. And so much farther beyond our control. And so if we think about the most recent conflagration here in Southern California, we had conditions that could not be controlled. 100-mile-an-hour winds. You can't fly helicopters, you can't fly planes in those situations. And so the impact of the fire was more highly exaggerated than it might have been. And what if we had had rains earlier? The ground wouldn't have been as dry. But we have a 3 or 4% relative humidity and 90 to 100-mile-an-hour winds. I mean, these are extraordinary circumstances that no twisting of a political conversation can change. Were there infrastructure aspects that we should have been? Of course, we could have done a much better job. But that's part of the learning process which there's a human intervention that can make a difference in the future. One of the things you need to be aware of is that California is not the only place in which there are wildfire dangers. The fastest growing type of development in the United States is development of the wildland-urban interface. And here, if we take a look, we start from a rural environment to urban. Where it interfaces is something we call the WUI, or the wildland-urban interface. And it interfaces in different ways, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But there are over 1,000 significant areas in the United States where this interface is being developed. And it's being driven by a lot of forces. One, people like to live in green areas. Who can blame them that? Cities are expanding because of the zoning regulations that limit infill. We're seeing Los Angeles begin to address that, with ADUs and things like that can be put in. But essentially, Los Angeles, which serves as the poster child for sprawl, right? Between 1970 and 1990, the population of Los Angeles grew by 50%, but the land use grew by 300% because of the way that we felt we needed to use land. And much of that was pushing into the wildland-urban interface. Here, folks, and the areas that are darkest are where the most serious wildland-urban interface challenges are being faced. This is all ripe for wildfire. It's a little bit wetter down here, so it may not happen as often, but the challenges are there. This is between 1990 and 2010. You can see some of it in the Los Angeles area, but you don't see a lot of it because it's already been built. We're already there. And so this didn't happen between 90 and 2010. In Los Angeles, it happened before. And the scales at which we need to be managing change, or the kind of interventions change, depending on the scale at which we work. So if we're talking about a regional scale, then climate plays an important role, the topographic relief, the hillsides, the vegetation type. What are the transportation corridors? Look at the problem we had before, people getting away from the fire. The roads got choked. You couldn't get away. And then as you start to get to landscape scale, we have fuel conditions that are critical, wind channeling, community scale, slope and aspect, the landscaping around the buildings, and finally at residential scale. Each of these scales have interventions that can be effective. What I will say now and say later is that fire science is not magic, and the interventions are, some of them seem so obvious or dull that you say, that can't possibly work, but it actually does. I'm glad this is being recorded because I would encourage you to come back and look at this slide later. When I teach this in my class, we spend almost 30 minutes on this slide. And I tell my students, you should make a copy of this, put it in your notebook, and use this to study for exams because it includes so many aspects of understanding urban ecology, from understanding the rural to urban gradient, to understanding the density of the built infrastructure, to understanding the notion of emissions and pollution, both from light and other sources. And here you see, as you move along this gradient, the degradation of agricultural land use, the increase in emissions, the increase in population density, the increase in building volume. And you see this is where the tremendous fire risks exist. Because as you probably know, there are fires much larger than happen in Southern California that burn in the northernmost parts of this continent, Alaska, for instance, that burn for months. They don't even try to put them out. Just wait for the snows to come because they're not houses and buildings and humans at risk. They just let it burn. So as we move from the non-built environment to the urban core, we go through land use transitions, and each of these transitional zones require a different response to thinking about natural hazards like flooding and fire and storm damage and so forth. So one of my beloved areas that I retreat to on weekends is the Los Padres National Forest, which I love. And this is an image along Lake Hughes Road. And it's amazing to me that you're so close to Los Angeles, but on a Sunday morning, not any other morning, but on a Sunday morning, if you leave your house at 5:30 in the morning, you can be in this section of the Los Padres in about 25 minutes. It's just stunningly beautiful. And it was a couple of years ago that this area went through a burn. And it's a serious burn. You can see here how dense the vegetation is. There'd been a fair amount of fire suppression. This is what it looked like about 4 years ago. It's coming back. I was just there a couple of weekends ago. But fire comes through these systems and rearranges pretty radically. Now, if the fire comes through with some regularity, then the heat isn't quite so intense. The soil chemistry doesn't change as much. In the Palisades and the Altadena fires, the fires were so intense, the soil are now waxy or almost glass-like, and therefore not accepting water and all these kind of things. And of course, the seed bank is destroyed under those circumstances. But normally, when fire comes through, the seed bank is energized, and these kind of systems will recover pretty quickly. There's different kinds of definitions, which I'm not going to spend much time on tonight. But again, you can come back and use these resources as you see fit as we think about different kinds of interface. And here we go from the wildlands to rural to suburban to general residential to deep urban systems. And typically we see the proportion native vegetation decline, the proportion that is being developed goes up, and development tends to include more non-native species, some of which are very very risky to plant and fire, because part of the way that some of these non-native plants survive standing alone in an urban context, as opposed to being surrounded by other trees, is that they have certain internal structures. They might contain more oil or other things like that that protect them, that become accelerants or fuel during fire. There's two ways in which these systems come together. There's a so-called intermix, where we interdigitate trees and houses, or in some communities, there's a real boundary. There's housing, and then boom, it immediately turns to wilderness. These kinds of boundaries tend to be dependent on how available water is. So in Los Angeles, we tend to see this intermix. I have research colleagues and do projects out at Arizona State University, and in Phoenix, which is a desert community, the houses only go as far as the water pipes. And as soon as the water pipes stop, everything stops. So literally you can be on one side of the road and it's developed, and the other side of the road, no houses at all, nothing. Because the interdigitation can't occur until a more thorough infrastructure is in place. So you manage these two kinds of systems differently. Here are other data between 1990 and 2010. This is the extent. Here we see the area of wildland urban interface in 1990 was um, uh, in 60,000 square kilometers, and then we see now over 77,000 kilometers. Housing units going up, population. We are adding to the risk because of the choices we're making on where we live, and that choice is in parentheses because some of these other places are unaffordable. Otherwise, people are moving out from the core into these new developments or extended developments because they are affordable or desirable. So here's the crux of what we want to talk about tonight. That wildfires are systems. And some of these data and insights come from a very interesting interview with Stephen Pine from retired ecologist from Arizona State University and Jack Cohen from the Forest Service. It appeared in the LA Times on the 14th of February. And there's lots of sources I could have pulled from, but I pulled from this because most of you have access to the LA Times. You can go back and get the article, which I would encourage you to do. And one of the points they make is that it is simplistic and not all that helpful to ascribe wildfire risk to one particular issue, such as climate change, fuel loads, fire breaks, response capability of the fires, political structure of the community, etc. Fire is as complicated as any other problem that we face. It is a socio-ecological problem. And I would say think more like hurricanes and tornadoes, because hurricanes and tornadoes, we realize we don't have a lot of control over when they occur. We have some, we can seed and things like that. But for the most part, we are vulnerable. And we tend to think of ourselves with respect to fire as being able to overpower the variation. And they suggest shouldn't think about that. We also, or at least the press, tends to talk about fires in apocalyptic terms and words like vaporizing and tsunami wall of fire and things like that. And they feel, and I agree, that such metaphors create a hopeless sense of inevitability and vulnerability. And what we do know from our own lives and from our own professional engagement, that victimization is an obstacle to problem solving. What we do know is that most fires start from airborne embers, moving way ahead of the conflagration. And that community risk is related to adjacent ignition potential and the fireproofing of your houses and the removing of nearby brush. And that community engagement at each landscape is unique and needs to be considered. And here's an image from the recent fires. And this shows embers moving across the landscape, well ahead of the wall of fire that the press talks about. These are the things that get sucked up into your soffits, that land on your roof. And it's amazing where these embers land up because of the Venturi effect of when these warm airs come through. These embers end up in your attic and can sit there for some time before they finally catch fire. And I said, as I was reminded that 7 miles away from the Palisades fire, we had live embers landing on our street in El Segundo. And so these are the ambassadors. These are the real causes of fire. Protecting yourself against this is a doable and possible task to take on. Roofing materials, siding materials, things like that. It means we're going to have to think differently about zoning and historic communities and things like that. Um, and communities will if they think it's important enough. I would also say it's really important, and I probably don't have to say this to you, and Lisa is going to say this with a megaphone, that we don't need to blame the trees for fire risk. We need to manage the green infrastructure because the green infrastructure is so important. Because in our everyday lives, green infrastructure improves the water quality. It reduces another risk we have, which is storm runoff. It reduces the temperature and the need for air conditioning. It filters air pollutants. It stores carbon. It increases wildlife habitat. It improves your property values, and it lowers crime rates. And we don't have to pay the trees to do this. We just have to care for them. These are ecosystem services. This is a community garden in Baltimore, and I include a picture from Baltimore, not just because I'm from the East Coast, but because Baltimore is one of the two cities in the United States in which long-term studies of urban ecology have been funded by the National Science Foundation. And I mean 30 years more. They become the models of how we export ideas to other cities. And the two cities were chosen. Baltimore is an old, wet, and cold city, and Phoenix is a hot, dry, and young city. So we could compare and contrast the findings. And we also know that trees are so important in improving public health. And as Dr. Romolini says, who was a co-director of our center, and we actually feel it's so important to collaborate with Baltimore that we have a full-time employee of the Center for Urban Resilience full-time in Baltimore. We have a satellite office because it's just critical. But I went to school at Emerson College in Boston, and that's a film and television school, and it's so important. LA is so important to them. They have a campus here in Los Angeles. And we need to have and urban ecology. If you're going to study urban ecology, you better have a footprint in Baltimore because it's the really the critical location. So, the trees, and again, I'm not going to go down this list because I want to give time for Lisa to talk. She's going to do, but the value of trees is just unassailable. And so our solution to fireproofing cities involves a lot of things, and it involves modifying how we plant, but it doesn't involve removing green vegetation. And I will say much of the work that we do at our center is that we end up partnering with cities and communities and helping them decide what the infrastructure should look like. And we've been doing this for California state parks. We've been doing it for not-for-profit organizations. We've been doing it for whole cities. And it's something we're very proud of because it's a collective decision. Top-down decision-making can be effective because it's expedient, but it doesn't mean that it is useful or durable. And ground-up decision-making and engagement of community is super critical. And this is from an article that was written about some of our work a few years ago. And I said, um, communities need to decide not what green spaces or animals they want, but what ecosystem services they want from their green space. And this is the fundamental difference between thinking about restoration and thinking about transformation for resilience. Because all of us imagine a time in our past where we felt things might have been better. And so we think, whoa, maybe we can restore a garden, a community, a city, our nation to a certain point. But there is no going back. And so I would challenge people to say, what were the characteristics of that community at a time in which you felt it was better? It might very well have been better. But what were the characteristics? Was it diverse? Was it unified? And so you say, okay, that's what I want now. What is the partnership with nature that we could do that brings that back? Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, when we were doing this work in Boston, you had people wanting to talk about restoring Boston to a certain place. And I reminded them that we now have magnolia trees on the Boston Common that make it through the winter because it's so warm now. The Norway maples and other species of maples don't produce syrup anymore, don't produce the sap, it doesn't get cold enough. And so The danger of restoration is that we can somehow restructure a time in the past. What we can do is make a more resilient time in the future. Okay, Lisa, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Alrighty then.
And believe it or not, I'm going to mute my microphone, which no one will believe.
Oh, that won't last for long. You'll jump in and you'll be welcome to jump in. I'm going to change this now to the, bear with me. Go. So as Eric mentioned in the beginning, I was standing on the LMU bluff in the height of the fire. It was actually on January 8th, and I was just horrified at what I was watching. And we had a staff meeting the next day, and I said, Eric, we need to do something. Please give me hope. Eric is so optimistic, and usually when we get the worst information about something going on in the world, he'll have something to say that will actually brighten my spirit and make me realize we can get through this. We can be resilient. I know those of you who have gone through your fire experience, there are no words. There just aren't. I'm so sorry. However, you know, you read articles like this, when will Eaton Canyon recover sooner than you think? This is very optimistic. This gave me hope, you know, that although much of Eaton Canyon burned, the native trees, the sycamores and the oaks, are believed to have survived. And many of them, hopefully, despite the burn scars, will come back. I hope so. And another article that I read, you know, what trees survived in our terrible fires and why didn't they burn? Again, this is kind of a wake-up call, especially for the cities that are deciding what to do with the influx of people who want to live in a city and the competition with green space. One of the things that horrifies me in my neighborhood in Mar Vista is, and now I live in Westchester, is when homes go up for sale, the property is sold, many times the old houses are raised, and the new builder builds from lot line to lot line, taking out all the plants, everything. And I'm horrified by that, because where is the room to embrace a tree that could shade your house? What a concept. The Theater Payne Foundation actually has an excellent section on the Los Angeles fire recovery. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. I just grabbed some eye candy from it. I just thought these were great images to look at. And one of my heroes is a man that I met a few years ago. We consulted with Greg Rubin out of San Diego, who runs California's own native landscape design company. And this guy gets it. And if you've never heard him speak, he does all kinds of presentations. I highly recommend, invite him for a talk, because he's going to take you into an area in your mind first that you're going to realize there is hope. We can get through this. And the reason I say that is that his company is designed over, actually, you're going to see more than 700 residential, commercial, and institutional native landscapes on property where the homes, the buildings did not burn during major fires. So he's on to something. And, you know, far from being fire bombs, a native landscape might actually contribute to fire safety. And it's all in the approach. It always is. So this was a presentation he did in 2019 kind of at the start of our understanding of these horrific fires that were hitting Southern California. And then in 2022, the number of residential, commercial, and institutional native landscapes that he's redesigned went up to 800. The guy is in high demand, and it's for a reason. And what gives him credibility, and Eric got excited when I shared this with him, is that they did a 4-year research project with the US Navy entitled Ecologically Sustainable Fire Risk Reduction. It's a fabulous paper, and there's a link here. You can go read it later. But there's the scientific proof of what happens when you use our plants that are adapted to withstanding normal fires. Now, obviously, the cataclysmic fires we recently had, it kind of blows everything out of the water. However, a lot of the plants will come back, even those that were burned to the ground, because they have deep tap roots, and they will come back in the next rain. This is the quote that blew my mind. He was responding to a colleague of mine who, but incidentally, lives in Mandeville Canyon. She and her family evacuated. The home 2 doors away burned to the ground. They lost everything, including the landscape. And he responded to her with this quote: "On a community scale, my goal up there would be to connect parameter slopes together to form a contiguous green belt to help catch and cool embers and disturb the otherwise unperturbed, ferocious flow of firebrands directly into the houses." That is visionary thinking. Now, can we convince our politicians and individual homeowners that maybe want to go back to what they had? Maybe we need to think differently. And I loved this very pragmatic, down-to-earth suggestion he made in one of the articles that I read. Keep chaparral bushes and trees thinned, not over-thinned. Remove dead branches and chip them up to create mulch below. Create green belts using tall natives such as Catalina cherry, sycamores, cottonwoods, oak trees. Create overlapping coverage, but separate it out with large shrubs like toyon, lemonade berry, separated by 20 feet, and unify the whole area with ground covers such as pigeon point, coyote brush. They're great stabilizers on slopes, and ceanothus and manzanita and sages. Fire resistance is much less about particular plant selection and much more about maintaining light hydration. That's key, because I was reading some articles where I could tell people were getting hysterical about this. And I have at the bottom of this screen the 2 books that Greg is known for. And so I highly recommend, if you don't have them, get a copy, because he's so down to earth in his approach. But everything he does is based on experience. And I love that. It's not theory. It's actually in the trenches. He's had the success utilizing the techniques that he uses in landscaping. And there's a lot here. I'm not going to go through it all, but this was a post he did on Facebook, and it was simply titled "Thoughts on the 2025 Los Angeles Fires." That's my bird clock going off. Would you like to know what bird it is? On this clock, it's the eastern bluebird. I loved what he says here. "My primary mentor along the way was the late Bert Wilson, and many of you may know him. He was the owner of Las Politas Native Nursery down south. He was also a CAL FIRE firefighter for 14 years, and he stressed the importance of fire safety since the beginning." And this summary, again, was reinforced in his study, tested during the 4-year research study. Hydration, not plant selection, generally determines flammability, and they require very little supplemental water. Using light overhead irrigation like MP rotors is essential. Mimicking thunderstorms in the summertime when there isn't much water, it helps the plants along. Shredded redwood mulch, lightly hydrating native vegetation. It can catch and actually cool the embers. Many of the plants characterized as the worst fire bombs benefit the most from light hydration. And while most of the clients had enough property to implement these defensible landscape principles individually, they can be applied at the community level as well. The zonal approach can be very helpful, and true fire resistance starts at the house outward, not the landscape inward. And again, he says, so how do we protect an entire community? For starters, create lightly irrigated green belts as buffers between the unmodified chaparral. What a concept around the perimeters of the community. Another woman that I was researching is a woman by the name of Dr. Melinda Adams, and her nickname is Flamekeeper. And she wrote an article, and she came to visit UC Davis, on Indigenous fire and cultural healing and not giving up on a warming world. This is a fascinating paper. I highly recommend you read. But one of the quotes that I loved from her was when she was talking to one of her elders. He said to her, Melinda, we're not revitalizing fire. These ways are not dead. They didn't go anywhere. We're reclaiming them. And I thought that was she thought that was a pretty powerful anti-lesson. And I know people are frightened to even hear about entertaining the thought of using burning, but some of the elders that Eric and I have gotten to know up in Topanga and Ojai have been telling us about this. And when I saw this so neatly and nicely worded in these articles, I thought I have to share them because we need to get back to this. Cultural burning can differ from prescribed or controlled burning. However, it's very tribe-centric and place-specific. And the lessons and solutions you learn in one area, they're not necessarily transferable to another. These partnerships have to be created and sustained. And I loved her very succinct examples here with the 3 C's: consultation, collaboration, and consent, and then the 3 R's: respect, responsibility, and reciprocity, all upheld with the tribe. Going back to our TEK knowledge. Nurit Katz also is a heroine of mine, and she helped to write this fabulous article that you may or may not have read from UCLA, expert perspective on wildland fuels management, and that they would not have saved us from the fires. And there's key takeaways, again, identical to what Greg was saying. Large scale and intense fires are not the product of mismanaged forests, and the most destructive wildfires are human caused. Shrubland fuel modification is useful in specific and limited contexts. However, it's not the solution. And large wildfires are inevitable, unfortunately. But there's things we can do, like home hardening, maintaining a defensible space, community and built environmental planning, and ignition reduction. I put together a quick list of some of the articles and the videos that I've been watching and reading about in books. And I just thought you would find this useful. Grab them, read them when you have a moment. The video I watched, called The Inconvenient Truth of Smokey Bear, is fascinating. And it was from an Indigenous perspective. I highly recommend you watch that. There's a lot of knowledge out there that we can tap into right now. And my greatest fear is that cities like Altadena, like Pasadena, like Pacific Palisades, are going to rush to rebuild without doing enough research on what can be done to change the course of what's going to happen down the road, because there will be more fires and there will be more floods, and we've got to figure out a different way to re-landscape. But what a wonderful challenge, knowing what we know about what our native plants can do. And just a little update for all of you on what we do at the Center for Urban Resilience. We really focus on community greening and education. We have, of program in Discovery Park. We establish gardens on offsite locations like schoolyards. We do projects on campus, and we do a lot of outreach and partnerships. And one of our biggest successes is something that Eric mentioned, which is our tree canopy app, which we debuted in 2019 up at Tree People's location, and we had a great day there. We had Andy Lipkus and this gentleman to the right, Jarlath, who unfortunately has passed away suddenly. But this was a huge step for our center to literally hit the ground running and go into underserved communities such as Commerce and Montebello and Linwood and Paramount and Vernon, that have very little tree canopy cover, but wanted some input on what they could do to make their cities, mostly industrial and lower income, better. And so we partnered with Tree People, and this was one of our catalysts to help us. And you can go to our website, the LMU Center for Urban Resilience website, and click on the tree canopy map viewer. You can look at the basic viewer or the advanced viewer. And again, you can see this was a wonderful partnership of all these organizations putting this together. What we've done to date, since it was launched in 2020, is we've had over 67,000 views, and the accompanying story maps have received 15,500 views. We are currently actively seeking funding to produce updates to this analysis, because a lot of the data was taken from the tree cover back in 2016. So updates are always good. And this would include an updated tree canopy assessment, as well as a tree canopy change over time, which we would love to be able to show. Another opportunity for assessment is specific to the Palisades and the Eaton fires. And the new data that was collected right after the wildfires. An updated assessment could show tree canopy loss and survival across those regions. We have not yet sought funding for this, but we could. And this is one of my favorite quotes. I'm sure all of you have seen this. And this is from Doug Tallamy, who's one of my heroes. It's pretty appropriate right now with what we're going through, because life is fueled by the energy captured from the sun by plants. It will be the plants that we use in our gardens that determine what nature will be like 10, 20, and 50 years from now. And of course, something he pushes more than anything are the oak trees, which are my favorite. They're at the top of the food chain. A lot of data on this. He wrote a great book on it. And I'm sure, again, I'm preaching to the choir. You all know oaks support more forms of life and more fascinating interactions than any other tree genus in North America. And this sign to the right, I have laminated in Bionda Discovery Park. Insects are not optional. It's not okay if they disappear. Insects are the primary drivers of our ecosystems. If they go, we go. And he produced this great chart that's available on his website about the keystone plants that support the majority of butterflies and moths. This should be the template as we go back to reforest and revegetate, even in our urban settings. Again, these are these great, very flashy eye candy signs that get the message across. And we have those displayed in our park. And again, I don't have to say to any of you, my heart just breaks for the wildlife that's been lost. It's bad enough that people have lost their homes and have died. But the wildlife, especially the birds, and they depend on us. The migratory birds, twice a year, we've got to rebuild our forests and our green patches. Because if we don't, we're going to keep losing our species, and we all know that they're already in decline. And I want to thank you. This is an image of a beautiful oak up at the Sand Canyon County golf course, and we think this tree is well over 300 years old, probably survived numerous fires. And the last quote I'll leave you with is one that really haunts me and makes me think very deeply about what is going to be my personal legacy. And one of my projects in Discovery Park is to identify all of the sapling oak trees that have been planted by birds. Guess what? We're in a 2-acre park in Bayona Discovery Park. We now have over 80 oak trees in that park. Most of them little babies, but I am taking care of every one of them because they're going to be the future. And this quote is one of my favorite. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Guess what? The second best time is now. So I'm hoping we can all find the resources to do what we need to do to bring back nature, especially in these devastated areas. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Eric and Lisa. Thank you so much. This was really quite wonderful. We have so if folks have questions to come in, because we have a little over 10 minutes left. I already see let's see here. I have one from Patrick. But before again, I just want to say thank you so much. They were both such excellent presentations and have really made me think a lot about what we can do now. So for first question is from Patrick. Can you comment on the distance between a tree and a house as it relates to fire risk to the house?
Eric?
Lisa, why don't you handle that? And I would just start by saying that, it's conditional on the age and the structure of the tree itself. Is it in the windward side? Is it the downwind side? We can be very predictive about, where the risky winds are likely to come from with respect, especially in California, where the Santa Anas become the drivers, right? And so, growing up in Cape Cod, it's surprising how often we had forest fires there, and the direction of the wind was not as predictable, and the fires would come from different directions. But it's a little bit more predictable here. And so, that would be the first element to consider. But Lisa.
I believe it or not, it's a hard question to answer because we love to have trees and bushes around our homes, don't we? But if you're in a fire-prone zone, and we all are now, what makes common sense? Do you allow or do you encourage a new tree to be planted within 10 feet of your home? I don't know if I can answer that. I think probably 20 feet. But even then, it could, if you have overhanging branches on your roof, I know a lot of the arborists are telling me you need to keep them trimmed back. You shouldn't. And yet we want that. We invite that because of the shade and the cooling effects. So I don't know really what the answer is, but I know Greg would know, Greg Rubin, and we can ask him and I can get back to you on that.
Well, and having the right person to help you decide that, because it's also dependent upon the vulnerability of the house itself. If
Yes.
the house is well sealed to embers, then the risk is lower. If the roofing material is not flammable, then something landing on the roof presents less of a risk. If the soffits are sealed, then the embers are not likely to fly into the attic. And so these additional components help you understand what the risk of the dwelling is, and then the risk of the dwelling helps to define how you manage the cost benefit effect of the trees.
Thank you. Okay, I have another one. This is from Marilee. What thoughts do you have about hydro seeding or so-called native seed mixes? How does one determine if the seeds are local to our area, as mentioned on one of Lisa's slides?
Well, it would depend on the company, do they have a list of the plants they have in the hydro seeds? Hopefully it is native, but I've seen some, that have been sprayed on hillsides that weren't necessarily native plants. there are organizations like Theater Pain that can give you a list of the kinds of seeds you want to distribute if you're going to use hydro seeding. You have to check the company that you're considering buying the seeds from. It's you have to do a little bit of research. Otherwise, they could be spreading non-native plants that could actually become, more fire hazardous than the native.
Okay, I have another question for you. This is from Phil. Can you be more explicit? I'm not sure if this is in regards to it. Are trees more dangerous upwind than downwind? I guess this is maybe talking about when you were planting the trees closer to the home. I guess he's asking, are trees more dangerous upwind than downwind?
Well, if under certain circumstances, and if we, when we go back and look carefully at the ignition histories that happened in the most recent fires, we have data from previous fires, you can reconstruct the ignition history. And certainly, if you have vulnerable trees that are upwind of your house, they're more likely to deliver embers to the house than if they are downwind. And again, you would need to look at individual properties to see if the dangerous winds are predictable there. Some of these canyon locations was very predictable because, you think of what happens, you have a certain volume of air that has to move across the landscape. If it gets pinched and has to travel through a canyon, that same volume now has to move in the same amount of time, so the wind speed's going to go up. And we make use of that all the time in engineering principles. Think of a carburetor venturi, for instance, that speeds up the delivery of air to your motor. If you're in those geographical settings, then you have very predictable, and then I would argue manageable understanding of risk, and you would plant accordingly. If you're not adjacent to hillsides that have V-shaped canyons, then you might need other kinds of data, and the climate data would be there that would tell you where the winds are. I mean, weather is very hard to predict, but the emergence of satellites, supercomputers, and data storage have allowed us to be incredibly accurate with weather predictions. Look at your phones now when rain is happening. It's literally telling you in the next 10 minutes where you are, whether there's going to be rain or not. That's extraordinary. The amount of data that it takes to be able to tell you that is massive, but it's pretty accurate. And so individual analyses of your yard or your neighborhood, which is probably the better scale to work, can be very effective in a homeowners association or something like that scale of deciding how you want to manage that risk. Remember, Lisa, we were brought in Culver City to look at a condominium complex that had maybe 200 units and to help them think this through with respect to planting and risk and that type of thing. And they were in specific geographical areas and they brought in the right experts that helped them make I think, some very informed decisions. I mean, there's some beautiful trees they had to take down
Yeah.
as they were just risky, and it didn't make sense to continue to have that risk, even though it was a beautiful tree. Um, I met who's now a friend a few years ago in Templeton, north of Cambria, and it's a wonderful little country road that's just so unbelievably beautiful. You can't imagine how lovely it is to be on. And I was up there one time, and people are hardly ever there. So he stops me and he goes, "What are you doing up here?" And I said, "This is just, I think, the most beautiful road in California." He said, "Well, let me show you my house." He was a retired professor from Cal Poly, and he had built this house in a fire-prone area, and he had used brutalist poured concrete technology, metal roof, and everything. It's a beautiful house, and it was surrounded by trees. But what he did, because he said it was tinder dry, the winds came from all different directions, and he felt unable to make a solid prediction about when the fires would happen or what direction they would come from. So he put these big trees in giant pots on wheels.
Oh.
and he had this little tractor. And when fires came through, he simply pulled the trees away. It was brilliant. And his wife was a former Olympic swimmer. And so they had a very long but narrow pool so she could swim her laps. And they had that set up as a fire suppression system. And he said it didn't add much to the cost of the house. And he said we were active participants in the consideration of landscaping.
Hmm.
Now, that isn't going to work in every neighborhood, but it was just inspiring for him to talk about this. And he's just done a great job. And these large doors that slid closed and soffit vents that would come down, metal plates over the soffit vents. He said, there are no embers that are going to get inside this house. It's got a metal roof. We just leave and it's going to be fine and we'll come back. And it was fascinating. It was a fascinating conversation.
How many
Yeah.
years ago was that, Eric?
I think it was wow. It wasn't COVID because we weren't wearing masks. So maybe it was just before COVID, maybe like winter of 2019 or something. Because every time I go back there, it says a locked gate in front of it. It's been sold. Someone else owns it now. And because I just want to go up and visit it.
Oh.
Jared, I'm going to jump in because I know we're pressed for time. I've been watching the comments and I want to just make a statement. Marilee, you mentioned, Theater Payne said, do nothing, let the land restore itself. Absolutely. In fact, Greg talks about that in one of the talks that I listened to. He said, at this point, see what comes back. We need to determine how bad the soil has been damaged. But a lot of plants need fire to get started again, which is kind of amazing to think about. So yes, you wait. And to the person that wants to do or was thinking of doing hydro seeding, you want to wait on that until you know what's going on. You give it some time to kind of heal. And then Beth Stone asked, can trees serve to trap embers? Depending on the tree. Eucalyptus trees are torches. Palm trees are torches. They're not native too. And so deodar pines, for some reason, are fire resistant. Apparently, they were talking in one of the articles I read about embers landing in the deodars, cedars, and not setting them on fire. In fact, they went out like right away, which is fascinating to think about. So there are trees that actually will extinguish the embers.
Well,
And then Mike Polka, he asked, where can we find a ranked list of non-native flammable plants? Well, I don't know, but we can look it up. We can research it for you.
and then I have one other before we let you go. If you don't mind, if it's okay, one last question I see
Of
posted
course.
here. Oh, I just lost it. Oh, this is from Jean. She said, I recently saw news articles about the policies that were put in place as Paradise, California rebuilt from their fire. Do you have any thoughts on them if you're familiar with it?
I'm not familiar with it.
No, I'm sorry. I will actually go and look because it'd be interesting to see what emerged, zoning out of that fear, because Paradise was certainly flattened, just absolutely devastated.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I mean, I just can't thank you both enough. It was so wonderful to get to see you again. I've known Lisa and Eric for many years now, and I am just so happy that they both agreed to speak to Pasadena Audubon. The Center for Urban Resilience is quite a special place in Los Angeles, and I'm sure we will not be seeing. Let me say we will not. We will be seeing them again. They will not be going
Oh,
away.
you will.
Yeah, we
And we very much enjoyed being amongst like-minded folks. And I have to say, you guys are lucky to have Jared. He's a great guy. I mean,
uh,
And we're going to come to the Gamble House for the hummingbird extravaganza.
it's gonna be
Can't
fun.
wait.
It'll be fun.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, and we'll have that recording posted. And have a good night. And I hope to see you all next Wednesday at Wild Parrot Brewing for Birds and Beers. All right. Good night, everybody. Oh, and I see this list Mike Polka put there.